All right, well, hello everybody, and welcome to this next presentation in the series of webinars on FusionReactor. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this talk, we're going to be talking about post-crash troubleshooting with FusionReactor. So it's an interesting twist on what I find most people tend to regard FusionReactors for. Most people, I find, tend to regard it as a monitor that they sit there and look at, just like this picture. And some people say, I don't want to sit around looking at a monitor all day. And I want to point out to those folks, you don't need to sit there looking at the monitor all day, because there is great value in using FusionReactor after a crash. Now, that's going to seem to some of you like an impossibility, because you know that when your instance crashes, FusionReactor's information goes with it. And all of a sudden it starts out fresh again once you restart it. And you're right, but my point is there's more to FusionReactor than just the monitor. So in this talk we're going to be talking about taking advantage of what you can get from the monitor about what happened before. You may be surprised, there is something, at least a couple things that you might benefit from the user interface, but then we're going to talk about how to use especially the logs and the alerts. So let's go ahead and get started. So again, my name is Charlie Earhart, and I don't work for the company that makes FusionReactor Integral. I don't work for Integral. I'm an independent consultant. You can find out more at my website, carehart.org. And I just focus on server troubleshooting all day, every day, helping folks from one session to the next all day. I love doing it, and often it involves showing them how to use FusionReactor or whatever tools they have. But often I'm able to show them that FusionReactor can uniquely do things that other tools can't, other JVM tools, other CF monitor tools. We don't have time really in this session to get into comparing them, but just take my word for it. I hope you'll see throughout even this especially this talk, that there are things that you can do with FusionReactor that you just can't do with others. So after a bit of an overview, we'll jump into what are the unique challenges in post-crash troubleshooting. I've already given a hint of that. And then what are the unique features that FusionReactor offers? I've given a hint of that. And then we'll get into them in more detail. And then towards the end, I want to mention some other resources that you want to be aware of that are not FusionReactor, because it's not the only tool in your arsenal. You don't want to use a hammer when you're trying to screw in a screw. You need a screwdriver. So there's different tools for different purposes, and we'll talk about those. And then in the end, we'll connect the dots and talk about how to find the solution to some real-world problem that, and I'll talk about reminding you of what we can do with FusionReactor. And then often we mention upcoming other webinars, and then I always end up with other FusionReactor resources to use to get started, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. And I'll try to keep an eye on questions as we go. And in fact, let me just look real quick and see if, nope, none outstanding now. Okay, so let's get started. So first, I just want to say that we are presuming you already use FusionReactor, so this is not an introduction to FusionReactor. I'm sure there may be somebody here who this is their first webinar they've come to, and maybe they're relatively new to FusionReactor. Let me remind you that we've done other webinars. We've done getting started webinars, we've done hidden gems webinars, we've done troubleshooting webinars, we've done enterprise dashboard webinars, you name it, we've tried to cover it. And all the webinars are available and recorded, so you can go back and watch those. But my point is that while you may be already using it, I hope you are already using it, that's my focus, is you who are already using it, you may not be using it to its fullest value. That's really what I'm trying to do here, is give you the fullest value. Or you may not really, again, appreciate what it can be used, how it can be used for post-mortem analysis. Post-mortem meaning after the server has died, and you're trying to figure out why. Also, as always, I want to point out that what we're going to talk about applies pretty much to any Java or CFML server that you may be monitoring with FusionReactor. So FusionReactor, some of you may be coming from ColdFusion, for instance, and you think FusionReactor is a ColdFusion monitor. No, it's really not. It's a Java monitor. FusionReactor can monitor any Java application server. ColdFusion happens to be a Java application server, but it looks to you like it's monitoring ColdFusion. Or if you're using Lucy or Rilo or Blue Dragon, those can all be monitored with FusionReactor. Or if you're using Tomcat or JBoss or Wildfly or Jetty or Glassfish or WebSphere or whatever, you can use FusionReactor to monitor all those tools. And the presentation is being recorded, so you'll be able to revisit some of the details that I talk about as we go. All right, so what are these unique challenges? So hopefully most of you know that FusionReactor is great at showing you the details of what's going on in your in your instance at any time of any of those servers. You can see what requests are running, you can see what queries are running, you can see the resource usage, memory, CPU, things like that. And it's all presented in this great, powerful user interface. And I'll just hop over real quick and show those who maybe don't look at it very much. This is just one of the many pages, the metrics, web metrics page up here in the top left corner, metrics, web metrics. Great way to keep an eye on what's going on in your server. And for some people, that's all they ever do is look at that. Maybe they only look at it when there is a slow request or seemingly a slow query or whatever, and they try to make sense of that. And again, I've got other webinars on how to use that fully and maybe in ways that you didn't even expect when you're having a problem right now. The problem is when the instance, whatever that underlying JVM is under whatever app server you're using, when it crashes, well, you've probably noticed it takes FusionReactor and that whole user interface with it. So once you start it back up again, everything's wiped out and it's starting over from where you are at that point. So how can you know what happened before that crash? And I'm sure this has led to frustration for some of you. And this talk is all about helping you understand how to make that frustration go away. There are features in FusionReactor that can help. And the primary ones are the logs and the crash protection alert emails. And then, as I said, there's other things that you'll want to consider in conjunction with these, and that's your application server logs, web server logs, database server logs, OS logs. And then there's other tools that you might want to watch about other applications running on the same server, and there's tools to help with that. So we'll discuss all these sort of things in some detail today. And then in the end, I'll mention that there's some related FusionReactor products, FusionReactor Cloud and Fusion Analytics. Some of you may know about those. If you don't, I'll discuss them briefly at the end and explain how they fit in this notion of post-crash troubleshooting. Okay. So let's start with a real-world example, assuming that your instance has crashed. It's gone down. And we'll talk about how to do what I'm going to talk about in a moment later. I'll give you more details, I'll point you to resources to help you understand them better, but I just want to do an overview right now. So we'll talk then about where to find these things, where they're further documented, and what to focus on for different kinds of challenges. But first, what can the user interface tell us to get an understanding about a crash even after the instance is restarted? Okay, I'm trying to clarify before we dig into the logs and alerts and other stuff. What can the user interface tell us even though the instance is back up? So first of all, some of you know this. It's really important to understand. When you go to this metrics, web metrics page to look at this list of what's going on in the environment right now, well, one really important thing that's helpful to know about when did a crash happen is that FusionReactor tracks here when the instance that you're monitoring last restarted. Now, you know, I've argued with the, or not argued, but I've debated with the engineers. I'd like to see them change this phrase from server because that implies the box, VM or real. But it's not about the box. This is about the instance. So again, whether it's Cold Fusion, Lucy, Rilo, Tomcat, JBoss, whatever you're looking at, when did that instance start? How long ago did it start? And that's helpful to look in here and go, you know, I know mine has been up for 31 days, and I thought about, you know, forcing a crash, but hopefully you won't mind that I didn't do that. But anyway, you can see here when the instance restarted, and you may come in and find that it was just seconds ago, or minutes ago, or hours, or days ago. So the point is you can see when did it restart. That's helpful because you will begin your process of digging into the other things based on when did the crash happen. Now, you know, we back up and say, you know, you might see that it restarted 5 minutes ago, and that may be the second time you brought it up. Maybe it restarted also 30 minutes ago, and 60 minutes ago, and 90 minutes ago. Well, this doesn't get into that. I'll show you in a moment how you can see that. Yes, you can. But this is just when did it last restart. And then again, the point of when it did in terms of time, that's really helpful because now if I, you know, were looking at this being yesterday at 14:51, I'd now know that I could go right to my logs and find out what happened yesterday at or before 14:51. So that's one benefit of looking at the user interface. We'll talk about the logs and some other information you can get in a moment. But before I do that, another point I want to make about taking advantage of the user interface even after it's back up is you want to look at it and say, well, what's normal? Now that it's back up, let's just assume that your problem has passed. It was earlier today or yesterday or whatever, last week. And now you're looking at the current FusionReactor interface saying, darn it, I wish I could see what went on, back then before the crash. Well, hold on a second. First of all, before you go looking into the crash, especially if this sort of thing is maybe new to you and you haven't really been using FusionReactor a lot, take a moment to stop and look at what's going on now. Get a sense of what your server looks like now when things are, quote, normal, right? I'm assuming that server's back up, everybody's happy, you've taken a break, and now you've come back to try to figure out what the heck happened. We'll stop and look at what's going on now when things are normal. And we've talked about this information on this slide in other webinars, but just quickly, these two are about requests in terms of activity and duration. These two are about queries in terms of activity and duration. And this is about the heap, and this is about the CPU. And the light yellow is the non-CF or non-instance CPU. I happen to be running ColdFusion. But again, it doesn't matter whether you're using Tomcat, Rilo, JBoss, anything. They all look the same. So anyway, my point is you want to look at what's normal. So for me, normal is CPU is pretty low. Occasionally something in the background is spiking. I have an idea what that is, but it's only spiking momentarily, so I don't care about that. Memory is reasonably low. Now, you look at mine and go, what? You're running under a gig? Yes, you can run under a gig. But the point is, whatever yours is, 2 gig, 5 gig, 10 gig, $1, whatever it is, just look at what's normal. How's your heap use? The dark orange is your heap use. How's that going? And how are request activities going, and how are durations going? Because you might say, okay, well, we typically just get a few requests per second, and they typically run in under a second, and now that's normal. Now, some of you know that you can also say, show me the last hour. So instead of just the last minute, show me the last hour, and that just smooths things out, and now we're looking at, okay, this is what it's been like typically over the hour. And again, in my case, my server is very lightly loaded, only a couple requests per second. But let me just tell you, I know you're probably thinking, oh, that's crazy. Ours is much, much busier. I look at these every day with different clients every day. And for most people, their servers are typically not running more than several requests per second, sometimes not even a few. Now, I get it. Some of you may have 50 or 100 or 1,000 requests per second. I get it. Doesn't matter. I'm just saying, what is your normal? That's all I'm getting at. What's your normal? Notice what your normal is. And the reason why I'm saying that is that we're going to look in a moment and see some logs that track all this very exact same information. And when you're looking at those logs and you see that it shows that the requests per second were 20, when your normal is 5, well, that would mean it was 4 times bigger than normal, right? So you want to pay attention to what's normal. And if the average request time was showing to be 5 seconds, and the normal here is less than 10, or 100 milliseconds, whatever, then you'd want to know that was much worse than normal. And I get it. You think, well, obviously it would be. Well, no, not necessarily. You might be surprised to look in the log and find out that no, before the crash, the rate of request was the same, and the rate of response time was the same, and maybe you'll find the CPU was the same, and you might even find the memory was the same. So you just don't want to presume that you know both what's normal now and what was bad before. Take the moment to see what's normal now, get that in your head, and then look at the logs and see what they show and compare those. That might prove helpful for you. Okay. So these are the things we've already talked about. Then I was saying that the next most important thing to look at is those FusionReactor logs. We're going to talk about what they can tell us about before the crash. Now, first thing I want you to know is that while some of you who've been using FusionReactor for years have just gone to the file system to look at FusionReactor's logs, and there's a FusionReactor directory, and you can dig around and find that, I'd just rather point out to you that since FusionReactor 6, there's a way to look at the logs within the FusionReactor interface. It's a whole lot easier in FusionReactor 6. So we just go down here to the bottom left to logging, log archive. Now that interface has always been there. Logging, log archive has always been there, and the interface would show you how, by default, unless you've changed it, FusionReactor creates logs on the hour. So here we are looking at today on my server, today, and it's Central Time to me, so the log was rotated at 9 a.m. And so there's 9 to 917 that's now in another directory not yet zipped up. These are the ones that were zipped up at 9 a.m. on my server, 8 a.m., 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So you can see at a quick glance, has the logging been happening? You can look back over previous days. By default, FusionReactor keeps 30 days, so you could go back 30 days. You can change all that under logging settings, but again, that's covered in other webinars. The bigger point is, first of all, what's new is that you can come over here and click on any zip of the logs of that hour, and this will download it to your browser, and you could open the zip and look at it. So we'll do that in just a moment. But before we do that, which log do you want to look at? Well, the point is, if I had a crash today at 6:15, well, I want you to understand, and I'm sorry I don't have one here to show you because my server's been up for 30 days, and I was trying to get another instance up to show you, but let me just let me say that this, if there's a log in here that's not on the hour, then that's going to be when your instance restarted. FusionReactor automatically, at the startup of the instance, will zip up the logs that were in that hour up to that minute. So let's say I had a crash at 6:30, or the instance went down at 6:30, or the bigger point is it came back up at 6:30. When at 6:30 it comes back up, I'd have another file in here, another line in this display saying 6:32, we'll just say. So 6:32, if there's something in here that's not on the hour, that's when an instance has restarted. Now sometimes it'll say in the comments over here that it's a post-crash rotation. It won't always, so let me just make the bigger point is you could look for that. It stands out pretty obviously, but the bigger point is watch the times, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, or 12, 11, 10. If I'm looking at previous days, right? If I go to yesterday, it starts at midnight, 2300. Of course, midnight is the next day, so 2300 is the last hour of that day, 23, 22, 21. You want to look for when there's a gap. And remember, if we looked at the FusionReactor interface and it said we had a crash yesterday at 10:30, then we come into this interface, look at yesterday, look for 10:30, and we should see a zip around that time, if it's restarted. Now, let me also make that point that if you, quote, feel that, quote, it's crashed, somebody told you, Cold Fusion crashed, or your application server crashed, and you come in and look at these logs and like, no, there's no log that's not on the hour, well then no, the instance did not crash. It did not go down. I know somebody may have said, well, we tried to run requests and it wouldn't respond. Well, if you look at these logs and it doesn't show a non-on-the-minute log and there's no gap of hours between them and you're doing them every hour as it is by default, then that's proof to you that no, this instance did not get restarted. Now, if you say, I know it restarted, I restarted it myself, well then beware, you may be looking at the wrong instance, right? I mean, pay attention to your URL, your port. You may have more than one instance. Up in the top right corner, there's an indication of your instance. So just pay attention to that. You may be looking at the wrong zips, or you may be looking at the wrong day. All this stuff is just clues that you can use to kind of understand what's going on. But the bigger point was, let's say we did have a crash at around 10:30 yesterday, then I'd be looking for the zip at 10:30, to when it started back up, and I'd want to open my zip at 10:32 to say, well, what was going on in my environment prior to 10:32? So I'm just going to pick, a random zip. It doesn't really matter, and I happen to be on Windows, so it opens up in Windows Explorer. You could use this in whatever environment you want, and in all the zips, there's always this folder called FR Log Rotator plugin. I wish that go away, but it's there. The point is just go past it. And now we're looking at the logs for that hour. And I'm going to go ahead and maximize the display of this. Now, before I go any further, I want to take a moment and see if anybody's got any questions or comments or concerns. Nope. And just so you all know, if you do have any questions or comments or concerns, there is a questions pod in the interface, and you can click on that. And I'll check it every once in a while. Okay. So in this folder of the logs for that hour, in this folder of the logs for that hour, and again, that point in time, let's say 10:32, that my instance had restarted, I'd be looking at the 10:32 zip, and in this would be the logs right up to 10:32. That's the key point, is that it's the logs up to the time that the instance is restarted, or technically it's up to the moment that the instance went down. So it might have gone down at 10:30 and come back up at 10:32. So the zip would be written at 10:32, and in the logs I'd find information right up to 10:30. Again, I'm sorry I don't have an example of that to show, because for 30 days I'll make a note if I do this again to force a crash for us to look at. But anyway, so the first log I would recommend you look at, and again, this is not so much a presentation on the logs. I've had others where I've gotten into in more detail, but this one is particularly important, the resource log. The resource log. If you didn't look at any other, this is the one to look at. And if you're following along, feel free to go get yours and open it up. And I just want to talk about some things really quickly. So in that resource log, I see the date. All the logs have the same date and time. And this resource log is one of several where they get written every 5 seconds. So I see 2, 7, 12, 17, 22, 27. And what you want to do is look first at the mem, and this percentage is the heap use. So that's just like that top right graph. What's the percentage of heap use, the dark orange versus the max? And these numbers here represent the used, allocated, the max, and free. But then the CPU, here's the first number is the instances use of CPU, and this is the box's use of CPU. Now again, we've seen that I've had moments where my total box CPU was quite high, my instance CPU was not, and that's being reflected here. And that's not really killing me, it's not hurting me, it's not affecting my performance. But if you were to see this for an extended period, you want to go find out what is that other process that's taking CPU. But let's move on. I just want you to learn how to interpret this log in general. So memory percentage, CPU percentage, requests, REQ, the third number is how many requests are running at that moment. Now usually there's none, and then there's one, and then there's none, and then there's one. So it's not abnormal to find that there's rarely any requests running. The third column is how many requests are running. Now I'm sure some of you are thinking, oh come on, I can't keep track of this. Really? You're just going to tell me? Okay, back up. I mentioned earlier that in a later slide I'll talk about where you find the help for this. So we'll get back to that in a minute. There is online help, tells you what every log is, what every column in every log is, how to do more with them. We'll get back to that in a moment. But I'm just saying, regard this as like me taking you on a tour. You can get the book later. Just sit back and relax and enjoy the tour for a moment. So again, this is how many requests are running, and then this is how many requests have completed in the previous 5 seconds. And down the screen, in my case, I'm not really doing much request traffic last night at 9 p.m. But the point also is that here it is at the top of the hour. This may look the same for you. At the top of the hour before your crash, things may look okay. That's why I said look at what's normal compared to your user interface. What is your normal typical number of requests running? What is your normal typical number of requests completed? And the next fractional number is the request per second. So if there were 3 that completed, 3 divided by 5 is 0.6. If there was, whatever, pick another number, 6 divided by 5 is 1.2. And then the next number is how long did those take on average. Those that completed, in my case, those 6 that completed took an average of 50 milliseconds. So I don't want to go into further detail. I just want to say that this is a way that you could see how are things looking. And there's a few more columns to the right. I'll leave you to look into those on your own. But so the point is we look at what was the memory like, what was the CPU like, what was the request activity like in these moments at the top of the hour. And then we'd go to the bottom, or if you could page down, it's about 5 minutes per screen, because remember it's every 5 seconds, so it depends on your resolution. It might be 3 to 5 minutes per screen, and so I'm already halfway through my hour. But the point is you could watch that over time or just jump right down to the bottom, and the key is what is it at the bottom? And you might find that prior to a crash the memory went way up, or the CPU went way up, or the request running went way up, or the request completing went up or down. Any of those could be clues, and we don't really have time right now to go into every potential problem. That was last webinar was on troubleshooting. We talked about some of the typical things you do, but the point is you want to, the typical things that you do encounter. But here I just want to say that when you're trying to figure out what went on before the crash, this is gold, because you might either prove that the problem was, for instance, that the heap went up, or you might prove no, it didn't go up, so that's not your problem. Or you might prove that the CPU went up, or you might prove no, it didn't go up. Or you might see that it was not your instance's the CPU that went up, but maybe the total CPU on the box suddenly hit 99%, even though your instance wasn't using much at all. Well, that means something else on the box is stealing resources, and you need to go figure that out, and so on. All right, so that's the resource log. Very important log to look at. I highly recommend you make that your first stop. But there's other logs that you might want to pay attention to as well, and some people don't know that FusionReactor has these other logs. So for instance, there's a GC for garbage collection, mark sweep, that's the typical name of what are called major GCs in most JVM garbage collection algorithms. Anyway, the point is, if I open this mark sweep log, it too gets written every 5 seconds. So there you go, 2, 7, 12, 17, on and on and on. And this is a pretty quick and easy log to look at. The last two numbers are what you want to pay attention to. The second to last number is how many of these type of GCs happened in that 5-second interval. Fortunately, none in my case. And how long did they take on average? That's the last number. And you might, again, find that you come into your log at the top of the hour and go, huh, I don't see any garbage collection problem. But that was the top of the hour. Now you go down to the bottom of the hour, and you might see it looks very different. Now, as I page down, some of you may have noticed little blips. So yeah, I mean, it's not unusual to have occasional garbage collections. That was one that took 3.2 seconds, but the thing you want to look for is either during this time as you page down, or especially in the waning moments before the instance went down or was brought down or whatever. Did you see the garbage collection suddenly grow in number? I've seen this suddenly full of 5-digit numbers, 6, 7, 8, 9-digit numbers, and that would mean lots of GCs happening, taking a very long time. And once that happens, typically your instance is going to be either unresponsive or poorly responding. But the point is, we can say either was it or was it not garbage collection that was the issue. Now, let me be clear. I just had a client yesterday who made a comment that somebody had told him that their server was suffering because of garbage collection. And I said, wait, time out. It's not, the garbage collection is not the problem. Garbage collection is a symptom of a problem. The reason it's doing garbage collection is that some part of memory in the JVM is high, and it's trying to recover from that high use of memory. So this is just a clue. This is just a symptom. So what about the memory uses? Well, that's what these other memory logs are about. And there's the particular logs I'd recommend you pay attention to is the old gen. What's the old gen? That's the where long-lived objects in the JVM. That's where they get stored. Now, again, it's the same sort of thing every 5 seconds, and just look at this percentage. So mine is only 50%, not the whole heap, but this old gen, 50% of the old gen space is full, and that's not bad. If it were 95 or 99 or something like that, you might find that there was your problem. It was 95 or 99 in the old gen. That could be an issue. And I'll leave you to read more about what all the other columns are later. And you can see not only the old gen, but also the Eden space and the Spire space. Those are usually not the problem. It's either the old gen, or it might be the meta space, or the perm gen if you're running Java 7 or earlier. So we'll just leave you to look into that. And then the code cache, same thing. And just they all have the same format. All the memory ones have the same format, and you're basically just looking to see what's the percentage. Now, I picked this one example in the case of the metaspace. I don't have a max metaspace. You don't need one, and therefore it can't compute the percentage that it's full, because there is no max. But if you have a max metaspace or a max perm size, then this will show a percentage just like the other logs. But it at least shows you numbers, and you can watch if those are going up. Anyway, the bigger point is, yes, you've got this information. And there's other logs here, and we just don't have time in this presentation to go into every log in every detail. I want to just remind you that these are things that are something you want to look at. And the key point was that the resource log pretty much mirrors exactly what you see in those graphs in the metrics interface, the metrics web metrics. But you're looking at what they were before the crash. So you look at what it looked like in the interface, that's what's normal, then you compare it to what it looked like in the log before the crash, and you might see something jump out and go, aha, there's my problem. Now the logs also track every request, their start and their end, and how long they took. So if I come down here to the request log, this is not every 5 seconds. This is every time a request starts or ends, a line gets created. And whether it's starting or ending is in this column, and the URL is in this column, and the IP address from which they made the request is in this column. And when it's a completed line, after the URL is how long it took in milliseconds, and on and on and on. There's columns about how many queries there were, and what was the status code, and all that stuff. optionally showing the user agent. So there's a lot to it. Again, other presentations have gotten into the logs in more detail, but if you didn't know it, yes, FusionReactor tracks every request. And you might also go to the bottom. Remember this in the context of a crash, we'd be looking at, well, what were the last requests prior to the crash? And we might see a bunch executing, and none completing. That would not be good. That would mean they were starting but never ending. But you may find that, yes, some were starting and some were ending, and that can be confusing because you thought, hey, there was a crash, nothing was running, but you might say, no, there was requests running, and they were taking X seconds, and they had a good status code. So anyway, I'll just leave you to interpret what these information may show you. Hopefully it'll be helpful, and I'll get back to something about this that is a challenge that's got a better solution. Now there is a JDBC log if you enable it. That's an option in the FusionReactor interface. Let me hop over to the FusionReactor interface, show you the JDBC settings. JDBC settings. So on the left is JDBC settings. And logging is disabled by default. So you can enable it, and you can say that it should only log queries slower than a given number of milliseconds. And I would highly recommend you do that because it's not unusual for people to be doing tens, hundreds, or even thousands of queries per second. I've seen it. And you don't want to be logging 1,000 queries per second. If they're all fast, why are you logging them? So you might want to log just ones that are slow. Is slow 10 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds, 1,000, 5,000, whatever you think is slow, and you want to watch them. And keep that in mind, because if you're not going to look at the log, don't do it. But if you want to see in the log, hey, what queries were slow, then you can enable logging, pick how long they should be before they get logged, and bam, they start being logged in the JDBC log. And we talked about the memory, and we talked about the GCs. And again, all these things are in the UI. I work with people who don't realize that all these things are in the UI. So you probably have noticed, requests, slow requests, and requests, longest requests. So yes, you've already got an interface for long and slow requests. There's also one for JDBC. There's JDBC longest transactions, and these are the slowest queries since the instance started. And then JDBC slow, sorry for the blue popping up there, JDBC slow transactions. The difference between longest and slow, and again, I've covered this in other webinars, but the difference is longest since the instance came up, and they may be from days or weeks ago if your instance is up that long. Slow is what's been recently slow. What were the 100 most recent requests that were slow? In the case of queries, slow being more than, I believe, 3 seconds. So I'm not seeing these in order of duration, like there's 3.1 and then 3.4. It was just coincidental that these were descending, but it's not usually about that, right? So there's 7 and 7.5. So this is about when they occurred recently and were slow. Now, my point back to the logs is, while you could look at this interface information while it's up and running, well, when it crashes, you cannot see what were the slow queries before the crash. But if you want to, you could have it logging slow queries before the crash. Now back to the GC stuff and the memory stuff, I'm sure some of you are like, whoa, 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 you're telling me FusionReactor tells you that? Yes, it does. Down here under resources, garbage collection, there's the garbage collection information, mark, sweep, and scavenge. This is how many are happening. Sorry, this is how long they're taking, and this is how many are happening. So GCs per second and their duration. And you want to see it being relatively few and really fast. And if it isn't, that would be a problem. But yes, you can see this stuff. And then finally the memory. I'm sure some of you are like, well, wait, you can tell me I can see the meta space in FusionReactor? Yes, you can. So if you go to resources, memory spaces, it's easy to miss because it just shows you looking at it like this and you think that's just a heap. But no, that's the Eden within the heap. If you want to see the other memory spaces, you go up here and there's the old gen, there's the meta space or the perm gen if you're in Java 7, the code cache and such. And I'll just say again, you might want to go looking at your code cache because I've noticed recently, for various reasons, that more and more people are starting to run into their code cache limit. So take a look at that. The max is the max that's set either by default in the JVM or set in your JVM arguments. And the default in modern versions of OSs look to be about 250. And sometimes the default varies based on the OS, the version, and the JVM and its version. But the bigger point is, what is the max and what is your number? And if this is getting close to the limit, sometimes your crash will be that you hit that limit. this code cache. And you're thinking, I never heard of that. I've never noticed that being the problem. I never saw any out of memory in the code cache. You may not, but the logs will tell you. And I'll show you that you can see things over an hour, over a day, over a week. And in my case, the server's been up for 30 days, so I can see up to a week ago. But it hasn't really changed. But you may see that there's a little bit of a change right there. But you may see this changing, and why it's rising, that's another subject. Again, we don't have time in this presentation to get into the whys of these things. Just want you to be aware that they're there and they can be observed. Okay? Let me hop over and see if there's any questions. Yes. Has anyone built tools to help analyze the logs? Seems like a good weekend project. Ian, let's get back to that later. There's two answers to your question, so we'll get back to that. And then Kenneth asks, oh, he's already left. He said it's being recorded. He was being forced to do a restart. Bummer, isn't that a shame? So I guess he was having updates or something and he had to restart. So anyway, yes, the answer was yes, they're being recorded. Maybe he came in late and didn't hear me mention that before. Okay, so now moving on. The logs are great, but sometimes there's even more value in what are called the FusionReactor crash protection alert emails. So the FusionReactor crash protection feature is in the FusionReactor interface down here on the left under protection, settings. And again, we've had other presentations where we talked about it, so this isn't the place to get into it in depth. But I'll just say that, and I'm really surprised I don't have this here, typically I set this to be if there's 20 requests running. Now, remember we were looking at my request running and there was rarely any. And we looked at my logs even, at the end of the day, end of the hour, there was rarely any running. But often when people have trouble, there's going to be many requests running, and it's going to be an unusually larger number of requests running than normal. So again, if you look at what your normal number of requests running is, 0, 5, whatever, then you want to set a number above that to say, hey, if I get to this number, I want to be notified. And you could just leave it at that, but you can also say not only if it reaches that number, but if it reaches that number for a given number of seconds. So if for 20 seconds in a row I have 20 requests running, doesn't matter how long they're taking, it's over 20 seconds I have, in my case, 20 requests running, I'd like to be notified, and that's the default behavior, notify you. You can also do rejections and queuing and other alerts. There's different types of alerts, and you can try to kill things. I'm not a big fan of the killing features. I just want to be notified. I'll take the information and work on it. So I'll save that setting. Now, to get the notifications, and we've covered this in other presentations, but to get the notifications, you next have to go to email settings. There's a link right there. It's also this link right there. And in there, you enable them. I think I changed this to show it to people in a previous webinar. So you enable them, and that's all you got to do. Now, if you want to, I would recommend, if you're not in ColdFusion 8 or 9, so pretty much everybody else, you can enable user agent logging in the notifications. The user agent is the self-identifying string that says what kind of browser or what kind of spider or what kind of tool is calling into your server asking for your given pages. The user agent can be helpful to see in your alert. So I'm going to save that. And then finally, it says that we need to go up to FusionReactor settings, and in here you configure who should the mail come from, who should it go to, and what mail server should they use, and what's the mail server's username and password if you need one, and so on. Now when you fill those in and hit save, do that before you do test, because it won't use the values that are there unless you save them first. It's just the behavior of the interface. You'll maybe notice also that I say FusionReactor at, and you may say, well, my mail server won't let me do that. I get it that it may not, but try it, because you can try it, save it, test it. If you get the email, it's helpful to get an email from something like FusionReactor at your domain name, and you can handle that in your mail client with a rule to specially deal with it. But the point is, once you set up those alerts, you will get an email when there's this problem. So in my case, I said, when there's 20 requests running for a period of 20 seconds, send me an email. Now, some of you are probably thinking, look, I don't need another email. When I've got a problem, I got my clients telling me, I got my alerting tools from What's Up Gold or Uptime or whatever. I get that. You got other tools that'll tell you, quote, that the instance is having a problem. I get that. But the value of these alerts is much more than just, hey, you got a problem. It's kind of like the commercial. I'm a monitor. There's a bank robbery. I'm a monitor. It's not protecting you. Well, two things. One is I want to say there's more to these alerts than just that the problem's happening. In the alerts, they tell you what requests are running. What are the URLs? What is the duration? What query is the request running? How long it has been running? What's the user agent if you enable that? So that's gold. I mean, you might remember I said we could look at the logs, the request logs, and try to figure out what requests were running at the end, but that's complicated because we have to find all the ones that started but never ended. That could be difficult. With the alerts, you don't have to do that. You just look at the alert, and it tells you, here's what requests were running. Boom. And there's much more to them. Again, in other presentations, I've gone into them in more detail. So again, look at other presentations. We don't have time to get into that. We've got about 20 minutes left, so I need to move on. But the alerts are wonderful, and they could be gold to tell you what requests were running, and even if you know how to use them, and I talk about it in the other ones, how to see even what line of code is running in the request. Okay, so that's the alerts, and they're really valuable. I definitely recommend you enable them. And at the top of them, they also tell you things like the total instance and CPU, system CPU, and the percentage of heap used, count of requests running, and all these other things that I mentioned. Okay. So now quickly about these things that I went by in passing. So the logs are stored in a FusionReactor directory. Inside that FusionReactor directory, there's an instance folder, and in the instance is your instance. And then there's an archive for the past hours and logs for the current hours. We've seen the different kinds that they hold, and I've talked about how some are updated every 5 seconds and some are updated whenever there's a request or whenever there's a query. Also, I didn't have time to mention, but I want you to know there's also a DB pool stats log if you've ever wondered how many connections are being made for a given data source from your instance to your database server. The DB pool stats log tracks that every 5 seconds. It lists each data source and how many connections there are, how many there have been, how many max, all that cool stuff. And there's also a classes log that tell you how many classes are being loaded and unloaded for those that are into that particular detail. There's also, for those on Cold Fusion, a real-time stats log, and it tracks really useful things like how many sessions you have, how many queries in the query cache, how many templates in the template cache. And again, that's in the interface as well. Some people never notice that. It's in the top left corner under Metrics, CF, System Metrics, Metrics, CF, System Metrics, and there's how many queries in the query cache, how many templates in the template cache. And then the sessions are tracked for everybody, I believe, that may be Cold Fusion, but anyway, under user sessions, this is a tracking of how many sessions you have at one time and over time, and a breakdown per the previous 5 seconds, minute, hour. And there's more to this I talk about in other presentations. I'll leave you to look into that more on your own later. So we've talked a bit already about how some can be enabled. The query log, for instance, has to be enabled. And showing the user agent, that's modifiable in the FusionReactor interface for each request in the log. So I showed you earlier enabling it in the alert, but in requests settings, logging, I can say, do I want to log the user agent? And I would argue for most people it would be useful to log the user agent. So when you go looking at that request log, it's the last field in the log. And I talked about these things more in a webinar called Configuring FusionReactor for Action. So again, lots of other stuff that we've covered. I know I'm going quickly, but check out the other ones. And we've seen how you can view them in the user interface. Now, as far as online help, what you want to do is just go into the FusionReactor interface and go to FusionReactor Help. So at the top left corner, FusionReactor. Many people miss that there's even a button up there, FusionReactor, or just click on the word FusionReactor Help. And that opens a new tab in your browser, takes you to the docs for FusionReactor for whatever version you're running. There's several manuals in the guides. You want to look at the user guide, and particularly look down at the bottom at logging, and the fourth thing in logging is log files available in FusionReactor. And in a moment, that display will show you all the logs that we were seeing in that logs folder. Here's each log described. So for instance, I said in the request log there was a lot of information, and among the many things that are tracked about each request, first of all, if you've never seen it before, you see a column describing each column, the relative number, this bracketed letters if you import it into Excel, and then a description, Excel or OpenOffice Calc or whatever you might use. But I was saying that the URL was there, the execution time, and if we keep going, we can see the CPU time, session ID, how many queries happened, how long the queries took, how many bytes were sent, stream stuff in the user agent. These are request details. And again, there's log information about the memory logs and the GC logs and the classes logs and whatever other logs might interest you. And I mentioned that you can import these logs into Excel. It really is very easy. And rather than get into it, we don't have time here, but I'll just tell you that in the help, in the FusionReactor help, if you just go up to the top left corner, sorry, I inadvertently closed the little selector on the left side of the screen. I don't use this, it's a relatively new interface. Somehow I lost the feature over there on the left. Come on, get it back. I clicked some button and it took away that navigational toolbar. I'll just try dragging it. There you go. So, okay, the search is up here now. So up here in the top right corner, it's kind of subtle, easy to miss. It's dark blue on light blue, but that's a search interface. And if I just type Excel, then it's going to look in the FusionReactor docs for any discussion of Excel, and the very first hit is importing and graphing data into Excel. And it's really very easy to understand. It's just a couple pages of information. The key point is that when you do the import, it'll tell you how to do the import, but when you do it, you want to make it a space delimited import, because the FusionReactor logs are space delimited, and boom, now all those columns show up in the interface of Excel. And to the person asking about tools for looking at the logs, well, first of all, just note that if you just pull them into your spreadsheet, you don't need to write a tool, and you might find you can get a lot of great value out of using the spreadsheet. You can sort things, you can filter things, you can group things, so consider that. I'll get back to another approach in a moment. And I mentioned the alerts, and we've already talked about that. I went ahead and jumped ahead of that. And then we talked about using the baseline as normal. And we talk about that more in another webinar as well. There's also daily reports that FusionReactor enables. If you put in that email address information, you will now start getting daily reports sent to you, telling you each day how many requests ran, how long they took, how many queries, how long they took, and that could be also useful as a baseline. You might look at your reports over a period of days or weeks and go, hey, look at this, our number of requests has jumped dramatically. Maybe that's why we're having a problem, and you can go figure out why have they jumped dramatically? Did you add new sites? Did you do some promotion, or is it just hackers or spiders or something else? Okay. I mentioned other resources. I just do this really quickly. Your application server logs could be really valuable, and I know you may have application logs that seem useless. You want to focus on your console or stood out or system or other out logs. And if you run the app as a service, these are special logs created, whereas if you run it at the command line, these are things that would show up in the console. So in the case of ColdFusion, in CF10 and above, you want to look in your instance logs and look at the ColdFusion out log and ColdFusion error log. You may have never paid attention to them before. They're very important. And CF9 and earlier, they were in the runtime logs folder, and people never looked there typically. There's also a CF server log that could show you when CF's restarting. Pretty much all it shows. It's useful. In Lucy and Rilo, you'd look in the Tomcat logs and the Catalina log files, and this Lucy stood out and Lucy stood error log files. And if you're just using Tomcat as an example, you'd look for the Catalina out, and again the stood error and stood out logs. In the case of your web server, just remember there's access logs and there's error logs, and for now we're really talking about problems, so we're talking about error logs. The access logs show requests and their volume and nature. That could be helpful, but FusionReactor also shows that coming into your application server. But the error logs will tell you if there's errors, and you want to look at those. So in the case of IIS, there's no error log, but you can look at the Windows event logs. In the case of Apache, there is an error log, or on Windows, you might find stuff in the Windows event logs. And there's tools to monitor your web server as opposed to monitoring the application server. There might be value in looking at that if maybe the problem's not in the application server. Maybe the problem is in the web server. And I have lots of such web server monitoring tools. So I have a site called cf411.com, and if you just add /wsmon for web server mon, I list those tools. Same with database logs and monitoring. Most databases do have error logs, and they can, problems in the database will flow back into your application server. And there's just so many to list, and there's lots of ways to do logging, and these monitors can be helpful. So I'll just say, remember the FusionReactor only shows you what's going on once it leaves your application server and then comes back from the database server. It doesn't know what's going on in the database server. So sometimes you need a database monitoring tool. Look at cf411.com/dbmon to learn about database monitoring tools. And then operating system logs. Some problems may be in the operating system, or they may be logged in operating system logs. So again, in Windows, look at your event logs. In Apache, look at var logs and the various logs that are there. And there's OS monitoring tools. You might want to see what's going on now and compare it to what happened before the restart, just like I showed you how to do with FusionReactor, but you want to look at it at the OS level. What was the memory use prior to the crash on the box? What was the CPUs on the box prior to the crash? FusionReactor happens to track the system CPU use, but it does not in the logs track the total memory use of the whole box. How full was that memory? What processes were using memory? FusionReactor doesn't track that in its logs. So that's where you need those sort of things to see what was going on in the environment prior to the crash. Sometimes you'll find out that your instance was the victim of something else on the box stealing resources. And I'll just point out that there's a nice tool called New Relic Infrastructure, not to be confused with New Relic APM. New Relic Infrastructure is one of a class of tools where you install just a little bit of software on your machine, and they send up to a cloud server what's the CPU and memory at a point in time, like every minute or every 20 seconds or whatever, and what are the top 10 requests using CPU, top 10 requests using memory. And it's going to a cloud interface, so you can go back and look at it over time, and there's a free 30-day trial. So I definitely recommend, if you think there's a problem on your server outside of your instance, get a tool like that and see what it may show you. But there's too many to list, so again, look at my cf411.com/sysmon. Now, let me just hop over quickly and look and see if there's any questions. Nope. So I mentioned other products that are related to FusionReactor, and I've alluded to elements that now will make sense about both of them. So first, there's FusionReactor Cloud. It's an add-on service for your current FusionReactor, which would technically be called an on-premise version of FusionReactor. So with FusionReactor Cloud, you implement the on-premise one, and you get this cloud service, and it's like what I just described about that New Relic infrastructure. It's FusionReactor Cloud sends key metrics about your application server, like long-running requests, long-running queries, spots where memory's high, CPU's high in the CF or Lucy or Tomcat or whatever Java application server instance. The point is those key metrics are sent up to a cloud server that's managed not by you but by the FusionReactor team. You just get the account and connect your local FusionReactor to your cloud account, and it sends that information up on intervals that are optimized and not negatively impacting your server. And it provides an interface that's similar to FusionReactor in many ways, but also more powerful in others. And a key point is that that information is now in a database on the cloud server and can be looked at across restarts, right? Your FusionReactor interface right now, you know that when the instance restarts, everything in the interface is lost. Well, the interface that looks at FusionReactor Cloud is looking at data that they've stored in a database for you, only for you. Nobody can see it but you. It's all secure. You can talk about that with sales folks later. But the point is, you could look at that FusionReactor Cloud interface and see things over restarts. So that's pretty cool. So contact sales at fusion-reactor.com for more information and pricing and get demos and things like that. And David Tattersall did a FusionReactor Cloud webinar about 2 months ago. So you'll find that in the webinars. Now, the person that was asking previously about tools for analyzing the FusionReactor logs, I said first, the simplest thing, well, is that if you get the help, you can often figure it out just by looking at it. You don't need tools. Honestly, I rarely need tools. But then second, I said you could import them into Excel, and that might suffice for some people. But then third, there's a tool called Fusion Analytics. It's not new. It's been around for many, many years in production, used by people who love it. It takes your FusionReactor metrics and stores them in a local database that you install, and then FusionReactor, or Fusion Analytics, sorry, manages. Fusion Analytics manages it. So it'll keep it from filling. It'll roll up data, analyze it, produce great metrics. It'll watch for it getting old data and age that old data off. That's a whole another subject. Fusion Analytics is worthy of its own webinar. The interface is similar to FusionReactor, but again, more powerful in many ways. And it has information about your server across restarts, because the interface, again, is looking at data in a database. So it is the other way. Rather than you write a tool, the gentleman who asked that question, don't go writing a tool. Look at Fusion Analytics. You might find that it'll be a lot cheaper to just get Fusion Analytics than to create a tool. And the FusionReactor team and integral, engineering Fusion Analytics team spent years building this and different iterations. So it's not an easy job. There's a lot of intelligence built in, and you'll want to just leverage their hard-earned effort. So go to fusion-analytics.com, and there you can see a live demo and docs and pricing and more. All right, we're getting towards the top of the hour here. So just kind of a final exam. Let's see if you can recall how FusionReactor could help with every one of these problems. When did your instance crash? Yep, you know that it can show you that in the metrics. Did it actually restart, or was it just hung up temporarily? Remember, you could look at the logs and say, well, was there a new log zip created at the time you thought there was a crash? Or the interface might tell you, yeah, no, there was no restart recently. How often has it started? Again, in the logs interface, you could see how often it's been restarting. Were there any errors in the other logs? So don't jump into the FusionReactor logs first. I would really recommend you jump into your application server's logs, those console logs, to see if they might explain what happened before the crash. You might find the answers right there quickly. But then if there's no answer in them, is it that there were some or all requests hung or running long? That may not show up in your logs of your application server, but FusionReactor's resource log, remember we looked at the resource log, it tells you how many requests were running and how many were completing. And then the request log talks about their duration and things like that. And maybe you'll find that there were no requests running at all for minutes prior to the crash. Well, if there's no requests running, the question is, why are no requests getting in? Remember, if FusionReactor is running, then the JVM is running, your instance is running. If it's not letting requests in, I would argue something's not passing it requests, and usually I'll argue that's your web server. So if FusionReactor is showing no requests coming in for seconds or minutes, let's just say, then I would think something's wrong with the web server or the connector between the web server and your application server. That's another whole subject, but just be aware of that. And then watch the memory and the CPU, remember the resource log. Watch the garbage collection in the GC logs. Watch those memory spaces. Were any of those high before the crash? I talked about how you could see sessions. Where there are a lot of sessions, maybe you normally have 1,000 sessions, and before the crash you had 10,000. Why were there 10 times more sessions prior to the crash? That might be a clue. How many queries were in the query cache or templates in the template cache for those of you on Cold Fusion? There might be a clue from that. And does the database show that there was a problem with the database? That might flow back to your application server. So you can see it's a holistic approach. Many things FusionReactor can tell you, some things that it can't, and you need to use other tools to help you. There might have been other processes, for instance, on the machine. So these are some of the key things to watch out for. I hope now you feel a lot more confident that there are many ways to use FusionReactor for post-crash troubleshooting, using the user interface to compare what's normal, using the logs and the alerts, and these related tools that we talked about, and these other tools. They're all great adjuncts. As for upcoming webinars, we plan to do a part 2 on the troubleshooting identifying issues that we did a month or 2 ago. So you can follow up on all the webinars and see the recordings at fusion-reactor.com/webinar. Just Google FusionReactor webinars and you'll find it. So if you have further questions about FusionReactor, go to the fusion-reactor.com website. You can download it. You can get docs, videos, tech notes, forums, and more. You can send questions to sales or support, and you can even call for sales-related questions. and let them know any feedback you have on this webinar or other webinars you've seen, or any that you would like to see. We definitely are open to your feedback and want to give you webinars that make sense for you. So I've come back to looking at the questions. I don't see any currently still, so I'll give you a moment. We're up at the top of the hour, so anybody have a question outstanding that I did not cover? And thanks for the folks sending kind regards. I appreciate that. Don't forget that all the sessions are recorded. The recordings will be made available to you, I believe, by email after the session is posted, and then anybody could go to the website also and find them eventually. Thanks again. One person saying they had a crash right before the webinar. Hopefully you'll be able to use what we talked about to help you get to the bottom of it. And I should have thrown in as well that if you can't make sense of this stuff, and if a quick support question doesn't get the answer, when it comes to trying to understand why you had a crash and interpret everything, that really goes beyond support. And there's available consulting. There's a site called cfconsultant.com, that goes into where you can get assistance, and I and other folks that Integral works with would assist you with troubleshooting. Great, thank you again for the kind regards, you guys that are saying that. Nobody's saying anything bad, and that's okay. You can share negative feedback as well, or again, if you don't want to say anything to me, you can say it to the support or sales address, preferably sales. Sales manages the webinars, so if you have any comments, send them to sales if you don't want to share them here. Okay, well, it looks like we're about done with the questions and comments, and we're right at the hour, so I'll go ahead and stop the recording and look forward to the next webinar, whatever it may be, and whenever it may be. Until again.